talking about Chapter 18, Activity-Based Costing. And part of this discussion, I want to actually jump back to Chapter 16, something I don't believe that I went over. The book talked about it, of course, and you had in your homework. The computation of a predetermined overhead rate. I shortened that to POR, but it stands for predetermined overhead rate. You use that when finding or allocating, your manufacturing overhead to your work in process. So we did talk about that in terms of the journal entries, but we're going to go over that again in terms of how it works with activity-based costing. So Chapter 18 is titled Activity-Based Costing. I have chosen to do a problem for you. I'm going to do problem, let's see, 18. Oh, I already told you, 18.3B. You have to do 18.3A, so it's very similar to that. I'm not going to go through the whole entire problem, but I am going to go through each of the steps, and then I'll tell you basically what I've left out. So I'm going to start from the beginning. For those of you that don't have the 3B problem either in your textbook or in your ebook, I did take a picture of it and I will upload it onto the docs in Blackboard. So you can view that while I'm going over it. I'm going to read through it as we go. I'm on page 941, problem 18-3B. Big Sound Inc. manufactures two products, receivers and loudspeakers. The factory overhead incurred as follows. And it gives us amount for indirect labor, sub-assembly department, final assembly department, and then a total. Next page on 942, the activity based associated with the two production departments is direct labor hours. So it's telling you here that they're using direct labor hours in their activity base. So if it's just a single plant-wide activity base, which is what we learned in Chapter 16, then it would the activity base would be direct labor hours. We're going to do that for part 1 here. The indirect labor can be assigned to two different activities as follows. So they budgeted the activities for setup and quality control in the it looks like final assembly, sub-assembly and final assembly department. So it tells number 1. So then it gives us some activity-based information in the problem. We don't need that just yet. We're going to get that in section 3. So let's jump down to the instructions. It says determine the factory overhead rates, right? The factory overhead rates, the predetermined overhead rate, under the multiple production department rate method. Assume the indirect labor is associated with production departments so that the total factory overhead is 420 and 294 for sub-assembly and final assembly departments. So once again, we've got sub-assembly, this is part number 1, sub-assembly and final assembly. That's going to be my abbreviation. And we have 420,000 and 294,000 respectively. So if I came over here and I was going to do this, I've got estimated overhead. Over in this case, direct labor hours. So I've got 2 of these that I'm going to do. So 420,000 over, let's see, the direct labor hour, the total direct labor hours for sub-assembly is 1,400, the book tells us that. So my predetermined overhead rate for sub-assembly is going to be $300 per direct labor hour. So under sub-assembly, I can go, I'll just write it again. I've got $420,000 divided by 1,400. In this case, direct labor hours. So my total is going to be, not a dollar, actually a dollar amount, sorry, $300 per direct labor hour. Okay, so I'll erase that, but I just wanted to show you how the predetermined overhead rate worked with this problem. So I'm using this estimation, which was introduced in Chapter 16 for this section. Now in this case, we have 2 different. We have sub-assembly and final assembly, so I'm going to have to do this computation again. I'll just do it one time. It says in 1, it says 294,000 is for the final assembly. So the final assembly had $294,000. I'm still using the total direct labor hours of 1,400. But this amount is going to be different because of the numerator change, and it's going to be $210. $210 per direct labor hour. Okay? So I basically used the predetermined overhead rate to find my rate per direct labor hour for my sub-assembly and my final assembly. So that is the answer to number 1. Number 2 is still talking about the predetermined overhead rate. It says determine the total and per unit factory overhead costs allocated to each product using the multiple production department overhead rates. Now remember, we have 2 different products. So this is now under 2. We have receivers, and I think we've got loudspeakers. Is that what it was? Yeah, loudspeakers. So I'm going to use these rates here to find out what my factory overhead is going to be for these 2 different products. So under my, so each one I've got to have my sub-assembly and my final assembly for receivers, and then also for loudspeakers, my sub-assembly and my final assembly. Okay, so we're going to have to use some information in the chart. We go to the chart and we see how many direct labor hours for sub-assembly and receivers are used, and they use 875. 875 hours. I'm going to multiply that by, for sub-assembly, I'm going to multiply that by $300 per direct labor hour, and then I get a total. Just multiplying that out, I get $262,500. Now, where did I get this information again? I got this number, this $300 right here. I computed it. This number, I had to go to the chart under receivers. It said how many direct labor hours were for sub-assembly. It told me that they did 875. I'm going to do the same thing for loudspeakers. Same area. For loudspeakers, they only used 525 hours. I'm still using the same 300. Excuse me, I'm not. I'm using, now that I'm under final assembly, I'm going to use the $210 per direct labor hour. And I'm going to multiply that out, and I get $110,250. Okay, those are both dollar amounts. I'm going to add those up. I get $372,750. Okay, so now the question wanted to know in 2, I'm going to read it again. Determine the total and unit per unit factory overhead cost. So I have my total factory overhead for receivers is $372,000. They also want to know per unit. So how many units did I make? It tells us that they made 7,000 units. So my overhead per unit is going to be $53.25. Okay, $53.25. Okay, next. Sorry, my computer just switched off on me. The next is going to be the loudspeakers. So under loudspeaker sub-assembly, final assembly, excuse me. I've got, under final assembly, I've got 525 hours here. I'm going to multiply that amount times the sub-assembly, which is 300. And I get, let's see, 157,500. That's a dollar amount. I go back to the chart under final assembly. For loudspeakers, I have 875 hours. I'm going to multiply that by the 210. And I get 183,750. I'm going to add that up. I get 341,250. Did I say 341? Yep. I'm going to divide that. They also made 7,000 units of the loudspeakers. So I'm going to divide that by 7,000. So the total amount, the first answer, right, the total is going to be this dollar amount. And then the per unit is going to be this. So they asked for 2 answers in this. And this is going to be $48.75. Okay, so we had a little bit of a crossover from chapter 16 using the predetermined overhead rate. I explained that. In this case, we had to use the predetermined overhead rate for 2 different places, the sub-assembly and the final assembly. And so we did that, so we're done with 1 and 2. Okay, so this all kind of from chapter 16. I know they introduce it again in 18, but really the heart of what chapter 18 is activity-based costing. So we're going to do that now in number 3. Okay, number 3 says, determine the activity rates, assuming that the indirect labor is associated with activities rather than with production departments. So I just erased it, but under the predetermined overhead rate, you remember it's estimated overhead is the numerator over your activity base. So it's just one activity base, right? In this case, it was direct labor hours. Activity-based costing, which is much more costly for companies to determine. So usually it's only big companies that do a lot of manufacturing that even use activity-based costing because it is so expensive to use. But they, rather than just choosing one activity base, they use multiple activity bases depending on what they're doing. And in this problem, it looks like they have several different activities set up. They've got an activity for setups, activity for inspections, they have activities for subassembly, for final assembly. So they have 4 different activities. And so we're going to find in number 3, they want us to figure out those 4 different rates. So let's start with the rates on the top. We have setup, we have quality control, that was for inspections, and then we have subassembly and final assembly. Okay, so under setup, the setup amount that they gave us in the book for the activity for setup is $138,600. I'm going to take that and I'm going to divide that by the activity. The activity for setups is number of setups. The total number of setups is 400. So I'm going to divide this by 400, and then I get a cost per setup. In this case, it's $346.50 per setup. So the activity of setups is $346.50 per setup. Moving to quality control. They've allocated in the problem for quality control, the budgeted activity cost is $261,800. They've budgeted for quality control, that's going to be number of inspections. The total number of inspections for the 2 products, receivers and loudspeakers, is 2,200 inspections. And so this is going to be $119 per inspection. Okay, $119 per inspection. So this activity is going to cost the company $119 per inspection. I've got my subassembly, $198,800. That activity base is going to be direct labor hours for $1,400. My cost per for this activity is going to be $142 per direct labor hour. Under final assembly, I have $114,800. I also have the $1,400 1,400 direct labor hours for a total of $82 per direct labor hour. I'm finding out that I'm running out of time on my screen. Thank you to my helper. So I'm not going to be able to, so I'm done with number 3. This was number 3. In number 4, you're going to use these activity bases and apply them to figure out how much per activity is going to be for your receivers and for your loudspeakers. Okay? Thanks a lot.